I'm George Mason, host of Good God, Conversations That Matter About Faith and Public Life. I'm joined today by Rabbi Nancy Kasten, who'll be talking about her passion for social justice and how it is rooted in her Jewish religious tradition. Welcome to Good God, Conversations That Matter About Faith and Public Life. I'm glad to welcome today Rabbi Nancy Kasten, my good friend and colleague here in Dallas, who not only has her own history of ministry in the Dallas area as far as being a chaplain at one time, but has continued that work in her community organizing and in her social justice leadership by being co-chair of Faith Forward Dallas, which is a multi-faith organization, mostly of clergy and religious leaders addressing things in public life that are important to the community. Nancy, thank you for being with me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. So, Nancy, if one of the things that I go through as a Baptist, a Christian minister, but specifically a Baptist, if I tell people, I'm a Baptist, they immediately think they know what that means, right? And I have to, sometimes I like to say, well, not that kind of Baptist before we even get started, because there are more different, there are different kinds of Baptist traditions, and certainly ours is not the same as Southern Baptists generally, but you are part of the Reform Jewish movement, and so when someone says, well, you're a Jewish rabbi, what does that mean exactly in your tradition versus what it might mean in another Jewish tradition?
Well, first of all, I will say that in general, these movements are quite integrated, and it's hard, and I don't like making too many generalizations,
okay.
But I do think when it comes to rabbinic leadership, there are some expectations that go along with the different movements. Mm-hmm. Orthodox is very much focused on both the written law and the oral law, meaning the laws that come from the Talmud, what we call halacha, the way of leading your life, all of the laws regarding keeping kosher and keeping the Sabbath and those kinds of personal behaviors. Yes. Whereas the Reform movement has been based really on the prophetic call in the Hebrew Bible to do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Reform Judaism, so before Reform Judaism, it was all what we would call traditional. There were no
Yes.
There were no distinctions really being made, and
Right.
some would categorize that all as being Orthodox. I'm not sure that was true. We certainly can look at different varieties of the ways that religious life was played out in different communities, but the Reform movement became a movement, and in a way all the other movements reacted to that. And Reform, was based in assimilation, basically, and saying that we will be Jewish in our homes and in our synagogues, but we also want to bring these the values of our tradition and our faith into the world in meaningful
Yes.
ways.
Right.
In our interactions with others.
Well, and that's, I suppose, rooted historically, too, in what happened in Europe in mid-century, right, the last century, as there was a sense of Jews being scapegoated, as they have been throughout the history of the history of their existence, by those in the dominant culture for their difference, right? So the pogroms and the ghettos of Poland and then the Holocaust was largely attributable to this feeling of being different, and Reform movement was trying to find a new way in the United States and in terms of relating to neighbors in a way that you were going to be as American as anyone else, right, in some sense.
Well, I mean, I think that that was true in Germany too. I mean, I think that was kind of the real wake-up call in a certain way that we sometimes forget now that we've been in the United States and feel so comfortable and cozy. And I think some of the recent events have shown us that,
Yes.
you know, history has repeated itself and it may not be done.
Yes.
You know, so we have to figure all of that out. You know, I think the wake-up call, the tragedy, the disappointment about humanity that was the lesson of the Holocaust was that, you know, despite the fact that the Reform movement originated in Germany in the 18th century and Jews represented a vast majority of the physicians or a large percentage of physicians and other professionals,
educators and business people,
trusted people in the community, and yet they were all categorized as one.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
But in Reformed Judaism, there is this clear sense of a passion for the repair of the world. This tikkun olam, is that the way you say it?
Tikkun olam.
Tikkun olam. Okay, we got my Hebrew pronunciation
We'll
here.
work on
We'll
it.
work on that. Okay, but there is this sense of duty to be participating in God's redemptive work in the larger world, not only in the home, not only in our own community. And this is something you're doing even here in Dallas, where I know that we partner on numerous matters of social justice. How is that rooted for you in terms of your religious tradition? Where do you find the source of inspiration for that?
Well, you know, our liturgy, and this is not limited to Reform Judaism by any means, but our liturgy, you know, emphasizes the role of Jews in repairing the world in the way that God would want us to. We have from the very beginning of the story of creation, we have this idea that we are all created in God's image, and therefore we have responsibility to preserve that image in every other being that we encounter. We have a sense of, you know, being responsible. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness, and we are here as caretakers of the world and of the earth and of each other, and you know, that's our reason for being here. And specifically when then we look at the call to the people Israel, the children of Israel, that call has to do with remembering the fact that we were slaves in Egypt and seeing ourselves always in that framework that we've been redeemed, and that in a way that gives us some sense of responsibility for
every other marginalized person, everyone else who's oppressed. And this is true of our Christian faith as well. So when we think about what is our reason for being, what is our mission to the world, obviously some would focus more on the relationship of loving God, but loving the neighbor is an absolutely important part of that too. Jesus said, he talked about it being the first and second commandments, but in sort of a Hebraic sense, he meant that as one, not two, right? It was more of a parallelism that these things can't be separated. They have to be the same. And when we think about who we were once the marginalized too. Were it not for being the community of Israel being open to us spiritually in some way, so that we could share in the favor and blessings of God as our Jewish sisters and brothers have preserved the witness to open it to Gentiles, we would be lost as well. And so there's part of this sense of, I think about, if we think of ourselves as being the privileged, we forget where we came from.
Wait, so go back and explain that to me more. That
Yes.
that Israel opens itself up to you. How do you see that?
So we draw upon this idea of Israel being commissioned to be a light to the Gentiles, a light to the nations, and that the presence of of Christians in the world is a part of the success of Israel in its witness to the nature of God and to our ability to see and learn what your mission to the world has been. So though we are different, though we are not the same religion, though we are followers of Jesus as the Messiah and the Christ, nonetheless Jesus was embodied this mission that went beyond the bounds of his Jewish identity, repeatedly talking about drawing upon sources like of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath and some of these stories, Naaman the Syrian, where these outsiders were healed and were met by the healing powers of the prophets and the like. So we consider ourselves to be, in a sense, at our best, I hope, that we are the benefactors of Israel's witness.
That's a great way of formulating it, and a perspective that I don't think we hear very often.
Well, you know, you and I obviously go to Israel and talk about these things, and David, and your husband David Stern, and I we've done the preacher and the rabbi thing many times in public, and they always ask the question at some point, you know, okay, George, David will say, okay, George, I have to ask you the question, and you know, are we going to hell because we don't believe in Jesus? And you know, it's a way of reframing this thing, I think, that's really important, and that is so many Christians have over time thought of the fact that we have faith at all to be the product somehow of the failure of the Jews to put their faith and trust in Jesus, when in a sense, our very existence as a people of God who worship the same God as you, even if somewhat differently understood, nonetheless is a product of your success in your mission, not your failure. Mm-hmm. And I think you know, we look to Jesus as a way of saying, here is the bridge. He is both the one that connects us and the one that divides us. You know, it's a remarkable thing in our continuing existence that he becomes both of those things at the same time, right? Yeah. Well, I'd like to explore a little more with you some of the specific things that you're working on and that you're passionate about in the repair of the world. When we come back in a moment, we want to hear about another partner in our community that's doing good work in repairing the world.
The picture of homelessness in Dallas, without a doubt, includes children with moms and or dads. The problem is clear, but the solution is even clearer. Vogel Alcove invites you to be part of the solution by helping to give back the safety, comfort, and community that homelessness has taken from these children. Your generous gift today starts helping the children at Vogel Alcove tomorrow continue their recovery from the effects of homelessness. What you can give them now is their chance to just be kids.
Nancy, we talked about your passion for social engagement and addressing some of the injustices of society, care for the marginalized and the oppressed, and those sorts of things. What sort of things are you passionate about yourself? What issues in our society are you working on right now?
Well, for better or for worse, I get passionate about a lot of different issues.
And that's part of the problem. You focus on one and all of a sudden something happens, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Or you just wake up to something new and think, I need to work on that.
Right.
Or you meet somebody, I mean, a lot of times it'll be meeting somebody or hearing somebody that really, you know, creates a sense of urgency.
Right. Yes.
So I think, you know, when I think about what has been more consistent engagement opportunities for me and that I've pursued, certainly the interfaith work and finding common ground with people of different faiths who are all looking for ways to create a more equitable, safer,
Good.
more just,
Yes.
more sustainable life for. We can just start right here in Dallas.
Right here in Dallas.
And do the concentric circles.
Well, right, and this goes to your being part of the chaplaincy program at SMU, where you were a Jewish chaplain, but you were in a very deliberate interfaith setting in that chaplaincy work, and now as one of the 3 co-chairs of Faith Forward Dallas, which is such an evolving thing that we're not even sure how to define it, but it nonetheless brings together people around the table. You representing the Jewish community, and then Michael Waters, Reverend Michael Waters, the pastor of an African Methodist Episcopal church, actually 2 of them here in Dallas, is the Christian religion, and then Imam Omar Solomon, who is obviously representing the Muslim community. When we're in that room, though, together, there are people of all other kinds of faiths, too. Yeah. These 3 Abrahamic faiths maybe represent not just their own traditions, but also the hospitable table of how we want to make a place for everyone. So.
Yeah, and I think that the reason that Faith Forward came together was to show that these are people who believe we are all in this together.
Yes.
And that building walls or excluding people from opportunities or transporting them back to other places or incarcerating them or otherwise limiting their futures and their way of life are really not based in any of our faith traditions in the way that we understand them, and and this is where I also do a lot of work with Jewish mindfulness. That's something very important to me, and that's where the Jewish mindfulness comes in, or the mindfulness in general, that we're all connected, that we're all part of one thing, that we're all interdependent. And that there is an abundance for all of us if we just open our eyes to it and allow ourselves to see it.
Now, see, isn't that at the root of biblical faith overall? That there is the fruit of creation, the way God has made things is that there is a continual making, a continual flourishing of creation. And when we begin to think that the pie is finite and we have to get a greater piece of it, then we begin to fight with one another over land or resources or dignity or privilege or whatever, when in fact the heart of our faith is that there really is enough for everyone.
Exactly. Right. And that goes for all of our faiths.
It does, absolutely. One of the things that happens in these conversations and these gatherings is we don't end up just talking about the question of how to respond to another shooting in a school, the strategy about gun control, although we do that, and we are doing that, especially with the NRA convention coming in Dallas in May, and we talk about how to respond to that. But when we do, we're drawing upon what is it in our faith tradition that speaks to this? And then we listen over here and we hear, well, that sounds like ours, but it's not, right? And well, and isn't it interesting that there's some version of the golden rule that we find in every one of our traditions? And it's fascinating to hear these echoes, and it just makes you think there is a oneness underneath it all.
Absolutely.
And the repair of the world is to return us to that oneness, not to divide us from each other.
Well, and I think what's been so interesting in doing this work, and I know that others from other faith traditions experience it as well, is that sometimes I think people like to come to our gatherings for Faith Forward in part because we sometimes are not so in sync with people from our own traditions on some of these issues.
That's true.
And we find these like-minded people,
right,
or like-hearted people,
yes,
in a setting, and superficially one might think that they're so different than us, and yet
Right.
we have this common ground.
Right, right. So one of the things that we've done recently is we brought Reverend William Barber to town, and Michael Waters was particularly instrumental in making that connection. And he came to speak at Temple Emmanuel, but Wilshire Baptist Church and Temple Emmanuel co-sponsored that event, and it was like a high holy day, wasn't it? I mean, it was
Packed
it was packed
sanctuary.
with people, and so it was quite an event, and I think there was a lot of energy in the room. But he is trying very much, I think, to bring about what he talks about as a kind of moral movement in our country that involves not only his own Christian tradition, but people of other faith traditions as well. And he's picking up this late in life emphasis of Martin Luther King, who moved from merely a racial focus to an economic justice focus. And this Poor People's Campaign is beginning to gain some steam. Can you talk a little bit about the contours of that and what you think might be happening?
Well, I think that Reverend Barber is interested in bringing people together who have been woke, right? In a
Who've
certain
been woke,
way, right?
that's right, exactly.
If you think about all of our faith traditions, descriptions of people who are either born again or, you know, or have this
awakening,
epiphany of some kind.
Epiphany, exactly, the
they,
language.
You know,
yes.
they get God,
Right.
you know.
Uh-huh.
There are people, because of some of the things that have been happening in our country in the past few years, that have all of a sudden recognized that the way we thought things were are really not the way
Yes.
that they are. Like we've been living our own life in a
Yes.
certain kind of way, and now it's not just that we're noticing that other people aren't leading their lives that way. We can't lead our lives the way we led them once either. And
Right.
it comes back to that idea that, you know, we really do depend on one another, and we really are in this all together. And the reactions of that to that have been on, you know, the extremes, right?
Of course.
And on both extremes, not necessarily so positive.
Right.
So I think that what Reverend Barber is attempting is to bring a faith-based focus to these injustices, these inequities, the pain and brokenness of our country,
Yes.
in a way that brings people together, that allows them to have experiences like the one at Temple Emmanuel that night in January, where we can sing together and we can breathe together and we can smile at each other and we can hug each other.
And we can cry with one another,
And
too.
we can cry with each other.
And I think,
absolutely.
you know, feeling the hurt of the world, as well as feeling the joy of life, these are both emotions that are deeply important to a full faith, right? And motivating, too.
Yes.
Not one without the other, both. But to be woke, as you say, you know, and as we talk about waking up to what's happening, is to realize that we are making choices about the way the world is set up, and we can make other choices.
Right.
You know.
Right. And that, but also that we can't make choices for the world. We can only make choices for ourselves.
Right. Right.
And I think going back to that sense of pain, I think you're right. You know, I think there are many, many, many people who are in deep pain, and some of them express it in ways that are, you know, that bring a lot of violence and
Yes.
hatred into the world. But I think when you do provide opportunities for people who are experiencing their pain to acknowledge it in community and to
Yes.
see others who are also, you know, to know that they're not the only ones, and that you don't have to have the answer to the
Yes.
pain in order to actually acknowledge it. I think that's a very reassuring experience.
Well, and it's really fascinating to think about that. That's the perspective from which the Bible is written generally, isn't it?
Look at the Psalms, right?
I mean, the Psalms and Job and all of this, where for once the history is told from the underside. for once the pain gets a voice. For once empire is exposed and the emperor has no clothes. And no matter how eternal it looks, power that is entrenched in systems that are governed by violence and control over other people, they won't last.
Right.
And so part of what we have in our very biblical traditions is this example of how when you let the pain speak and when you let people who are hurting and who have been victimized have a voice, and you don't try to tell their story for them or interpret it, now you're starting to hear the genuine voice of God at work in the world. And that's a beautiful thing to watch, isn't it?
Right,
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah. So this is the kind of work we're getting into. I think all of our traditions struggle with, isn't it just enough to change people's hearts and attitudes on the one hand, and others think, well, no, that's not important. It's just about policy. If we could just change policy, then everything would be okay. But it's really not such a binary thing, is it? It's there's an either or. There's not an either or. It's a both and.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's giving people new ways to look at things that are different than the ways they have looked at them before, and seeing possibilities and opportunities rather than threats.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, I think, it's really, really hard right now because there is such uncertainty, and we don't really know what the leadership of our country is going to do in any given day or moment. Right. And there's such diversity in responses and in and so when you don't know what to expect, of course the immediate response is going to be fear, right?
Yes.
We're human. We're gonna be scared when we see something that's not familiar, that we can't trust, or that we don't know whether or not to believe. So we have to really do a lot of work to turn that fear into a sense of opportunity and potential.
And we do, but this is where I always look for the bright side of this, is that in moments like this, we are in a position, because of our faith tradition, to be able to offer an alternative that is timeless, that it's enduring, and it's proven, and we can say life can be rooted in love, not fear.
But that's why we have to get together with other people, other clergy who are doing the same thing, because it can get lonely and challenging.
Exactly. And one of the beautiful things, and I thank you for your leadership about this in Dallas, really, because we have both been here long enough to have known how isolated our religious traditions have been very often, and how difficult it has been to respond with a harmonious voice, not one voice, but at least a harmony of voices to the challenges of our community. And you have joined with others in creating a model here that calls everybody to the table and gives an opportunity to hear a really beautiful word of hope. And I thank you for it.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for being a part of it, and thank you for doing everything that you're doing to help people see the potential and opportunities in very challenging times.
They really are. Well, good to be in it with you. Thanks for being on Good God.
Thank you, George.
Okay, Nancy.
The picture of homelessness in Dallas, without a doubt, includes children with moms and or dads. The problem is clear, but the solution is even clearer. Vogel Alcove invites you to be part of the solution by helping to give back the safety, comfort, and community that homelessness has taken from these children. Your generous gift today starts helping the children at Vogel Alcove tomorrow continue their recovery from the effects of homelessness. What you can give them now is their chance to just be kids.